right, guys, welcome back to season 2 of the Anvil Hour Podcast. Today's guest is a personal friend and another special operations veteran. This is Eric Gross. Eric is a special operations veteran of the 3rd Ranger Battalion, where he served as a forward observer. After service, he pursued schooling in both gunsmithing and mechanical engineering. Eric is a seasoned through hiker and an East Coast peak bagger with over 100 mountains under his belt, and today stands as head of operations for Spirit of Kalash. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. It's good to have me. It's awesome to see the podcast coming together after talking about it on the trail.
Yeah, man,
Really
it's going to be, absolutely. It's going to be an exciting topic today. Before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes today, let's go ahead and give a little more background on yourself. So tell me, where did you grow up, and give me a little bit of history about your time in the military.
Yeah, so I grew up outside of Syracuse, New York, in the Finger Lakes. I pretty much always knew that I wanted to be military, had a good idea I wanted to be Army, but I went to each recruiter, asked about their special operations program. When I went to the Army recruiter, he was former 175, so that kind of set me in. I enlisted with an option 4 as a forward observer, which is an airborne contract. He gave me a lot of help as far as job knowledge, Ranger history, extra PT, and kind of gave me the tools I needed to pick up my option 40 in AIT, which is the actual job training for forward observer at Fort Sill. So I enlisted in 2012, right out of high school. I had about 3 weeks after graduation, and then went through, picked up my option 40 right before airborne school, and then went straight on to RASP. Graduated RASP in 2013, and then went on to 3rd Ranger Battalion, did rotations in Afghanistan and Korea.
Okay, awesome. And just for the listeners, can you give us a little explanation of what is a forward observer?
Yeah, so a forward observer in Ranger Regiment is a little bit different than Big Army. Regular Army, a forward observer primarily is coordinating artillery with the infantry. In Ranger Regiment, there's a lot more aircraft involved just because we mostly use aircraft and organic mortars. So my job is primarily to help with the JTAC that's on the ground, and we would coordinate airstrikes, coordinate the helicopters landing, when we're going in for infill or exfil, and working with our organic mortars and fires.
Okay, outstanding. So after service, you pursued schooling in 2 different fields, so both gunsmithing and mechanical engineering, which where you currently stand is where they have melded together. So tell us a little bit about why did you decide to pursue those schooling routes, and just a little info about the programs that you went through.
Yeah, so I initially went in on GI Bill, community college, and originally I was looking at aerospace engineering. I really liked aircraft, and I really liked the space program, and it was something that I thought I wanted to pursue. Once I realized that aerospace engineering is a lot of sitting in a room full of whiteboards, that quickly got pretty stir crazy. I happened to take a metallurgy class, and I was just realized the potential. And I'd always been a tinkerer with firearms. When we were still in regiment, I would work on people's personal firearms and just kind of help them, be like, hey man, what do you think about putting this in? And I kind of realized it one day. I was like, well, I love working on firearms, and I like working with metal and working on actual mechanical things. So I transferred into the Pennsylvania Gunsmith School's Master Gunsmithing program, which is where I was able to kind of meld it all together with what I have learned on the engineering side and give it a firearms context.
Okay, awesome. That's pretty exciting. So we had mentioned that you're a seasoned through hiker and a peak bagger. Obviously, we're going to get into quite a bit of that during this episode, but let's just give a definition of what is a through hiker and what is a peak bagger.
So a through hiker is somebody that's doing usually a long distance hike. It could be a couple 100 miles. It could be as long as a national trail where, you're hiking thousands of miles. Peak bagger is somebody that's more just, if you think of running up to the top of a mountain, saying you climbed it, and then running back down. That's basically peak bagging.
Okay, awesome. And again, we're going to get into a little more detail of this later on in the episode, but give us a little bit of the understanding of what is Spirit of Kalash.
Spirit of Kalash is a Type 7 manufacturer. We're actually in the process of getting our SOT, and we specialize in custom AK manufacturing.
Okay, awesome. So let's go ahead and set the stage for what is the purpose and kind of today's topic for this podcast.
So today we're mostly looking at transitions in significant life events and how to navigate in a way that's healthy.
Awesome. And so that will make a little more sense when we kind of talk about, so where did me and you actually meet?
So if I recall correctly, we were coming into Harrisburg, Virginia, and we had both decided independently before we had met to take a rest day at Angel's Rest Hiker Hostel there in Harrisburg. And we just happened to meet up at the hostel there.
Okay, so awesome. So a little more background on that. We were both through hiking the Appalachian Trail in 2021. At this point, we were over 50% complete each. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say so at that point.
Perfect. So let's talk about what we obviously found ourselves during a through hike, which I've personally talked about on this platform prior. But where did your personal passion for hiking come from? And then why did you choose the Appalachian Trail?
So originally I was in Boy Scouts. I ended up being an Eagle Scout, and I was lucky in that we had a group that was very active with not through hike long distance, but for high schoolers, doing 50-mile hikes up in the Adirondacks. And that's kind of where I got my love of the mountains. In Ranger Regiment, we went up for mountaineering training up in Alaska, and that really I love the mountains. So when I went into college after the Army, I had met a friend of mine, Michael, who was my hiking partner for all the peak bagging and one of the initial crew that started on the trail. And we went through and completed the Adirondack 46 high peaks over the summer while we were going to school.
Okay, awesome. So the Appalachian Trail was kind of an agreement that you guys came to. Now, quick question. Did this individual complete the trail with you?
So Mike, unfortunately, and this is a thing that I'm sure you know just from how many people it happened with you, kind of succumbed to injuries. And I mean, that's half of doing those long distance hikes is just not getting hurt.
Yeah.
Originally wasn't even my idea. There was 3 of us. And I was like, yeah, I'll do the trail. I'm getting out of gunsmith school in May. So we set up a flip-flop hike, and the third member of our party snapped his ankle before even starting the trail. So that was no-go for him. And then right after we did our flip, unfortunately, Mike had pretty severe injuries to his shins and his feet, and he just couldn't keep walking. So,
okay. Awesome. So we're obviously going to talk about, how can you prevent some of that stuff, and also, to what level can you push through some of that stuff? But just for a quick definition, can you explain to the listeners what is a flip-flop compared to a traditional nobo or sobo? So give a definition of all 3 terms, please.
Yeah, so a northbound hike is when you start in Georgia and hike to Maine. Overall, probably the most social type of through hike you're going to have. That's where most of the hikers are. A southbound is when you start in Maine and hike to Georgia. It tends to be a much more solitary experience. I think it's less than 10% of through hikers that complete every year are southbound. And a flip-flop is kind of a hybrid of the two, usually because you can't start at the normal time that everybody starts. So we started in the beginning of June, which is relatively late for a through hike. And so we had to start farther north than you would want to normally, just so that we could hit Katahdin while you had good weather up north. And then we drove that day after Katahdin down to our start point and then hiked south to Georgia.
Awesome. So just so people kind of understand, when you go to hike the Appalachian Trail specifically for a through hike, you have about a 6 to 7 month window where weather is bad on both the south and north hand sides. And so the traditional no-bow hike is normally done because, according to the terrain, it's the easier ramp up. You're going to deal with some harder mountains kind of honestly within that first week. But as far as the terrain that you're working yourself towards on a northbound route, it actually helps you kind of grow your way through. There's a lot more shelters. The trail was designed to be hiked in that direction. And so the support and kind of like the distance between shelters and things along those lines is a lot heavier at that beginning. It starts to spread its way out all the way until you get to about the last 100 miles on the north hand side. So when it comes to that time window, when you're dealing with basically snow on the, around April and then around October, you have to decide, okay, if I can't make it on to the beginning of the northbound route by somewhere in the beginning of May, you have to push yourself further up the trail. Otherwise, you will not make it to the north end before they could potentially close Baxter State Park due to snow, right? So that's kind of one of the big considerations there.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So last couple questions before we get into the main topics for today is, how long did the trail take you, and what was your longest mileage day during the trail?
So it took me just under 5 months. My longest day on the trail was when I did the 4-state challenge from Pennsylvania to Virginia. And because I thought it would sound cooler if I did 4 extra miles, I did a 50-mile day that day. Did not feel cool at the end of the day, but 50 miles.
That's awesome. So kind of explain, what is that 4-state challenge? Because that's a pretty cool thing. Go ahead.
So somebody decided, how cool would it sound to say I started in either Virginia or Pennsylvania and cross 4 states? So you start pretty much at the Pennsylvania-Virginia border, right on the Mason-Dixon line. You hike through, Maryland on the Mason-Dixon line, and you hike Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, and Virginia in one day.
Awesome. And just to be clear, we're not covering the entire state. We're just crossing the state line so that we have right into those states. Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So that kind of brings us to, now we're getting into our main topic, which is, as you said, we're talking about being in a transitional phase. So just for the listeners, we're going to be constantly referencing our transitional phase was when we exited the military. But what you're also going to see is our transitional phases were also after college, we're also after business, we're after other significant life events. So this is very applicable to both the veteran community, but also just every single through hiker will find themselves pursuing that for some reason. And a lot of it is they are in some sort of transitional space, whether that is positive, negative, or indifferent. They're getting ready to embark on a new journey. A lot of things we saw was kids fresh out of college, and before they get into their career field, they're like, okay, I have this, 4 to 6 month opportunity to go and do something crazy that I probably won't be able to do for another 10 or 15 years. You have people getting out of the military, exact same thing, where you have this break in, I was in this hypersensitive focused career, I'm getting ready to start another one, and I'm going to give a little time to myself. On the other end of that, we saw people that had just retired, people leaving different career fields, a whole variety of reasons, people traveling internationally just to hike the trail because of its significance. So either way, the transitional space, there's a huge opportunity for personal growth and development during that time, which will be kind of our main focus. So outside of just the agreement that you had with your friends that you peak bagged with, what was the inspiration for you to take on such a daunting challenge? Because from what I understand, to this date, there is somewhere in the world of between 20 and 25,000 through hikers who have actually successfully completed the Appalachian Trail. So knowing that that puts you in such an exclusive club, what was the motivation behind that made you take on that challenge?
Well, one, I think after the Army, you definitely try to find challenging things to do, and that gets a lot harder to do in the civilian world. I found a great outlet through jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts training. I found a really good gym up in Syracuse after I got out, and that was a huge help. But I loved the adventure after doing the 46 in one summer, and I was like, hey, the same thing you said, there's a natural hiccup, in that graduating gunsmith school, getting ready to go out into the world. And I was like, this is kind of the time if we're going to do it, in the next few years. So let's go for it.
And I think that's pretty cool that you mentioned like a natural hiccup, because I think it's something that most people in life are afforded that multiple times in their life. It's whether they're aware of the opportunity and whether they can plan for it. That's a big thing is these type of events, these, adventure athlete activities require excessive planning at the beginning. And so having, forward thought into your life and your career paths, and even, I'm getting ready to exit the military, say in a year, creating a plan of, how can I optimize and take advantage of this unique opportunity before I put myself back into another 5 to 10 or 20-year commitment, whether that's with family, business, et cetera, type of thing. So let's kind of talk about the planning piece of it. So how do you think that your background, all the way back to Eagle Scout, all the way through combat operations in the Middle East, how do you think your background helped prepare you and make you not just an asset to yourself, but to other hikers on the trail?
I think so. From the Boy Scout aspect, definitely the basic backwoods skills, even orienteering and map reading, surprisingly, is not a common skill on the trail, at least on the Appalachian Trail. It's one of the downsides to these apps. They're really helpful for planning, but you've got people that don't know how to read a map going into a high wilderness area. And that definitely is, at least as an emergency, being able to take a compass and realize which way you're looking at is pretty important. As far as the military goes, I think more particularly special operations, right? You have those time-sensitive targets. And so you get this intense, brief period of planning where you get the best that you can. And then it's time and you got to go execute, so that ability to do intense and meticulous planning, but then also understand that plan's going to change and not being held to it. You don't want to be that guy on the trail that's got a spreadsheet for every single day where he's going to be for the next 6 months. And then he's devastated because 2 weeks in, he's already off track,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, from our personal backgrounds, there's kind of an assumption, not that it's wrong, that there's a certain level of resiliency or endurance that we have that maybe other people don't. And I would agree and disagree. And the reason I agree is, yes, we both have that. The thing I disagree with is that other people don't have that. I think one of the cool opportunities that certain things in life, and the thing is, the Appalachian Trail will end up teaching people something similar by the time they're done. But stepping out on it, the military does give you a little bit of experience having to be adaptable, having to deal with things that go wrong, and having no other option except to get to the end state. And I think that's something that we see on the Appalachian Trail a lot, or other, significant events in people's life, is outside of the military, there's always kind of a backup plan or a plan B, meaning not like, okay, hey, this plan didn't work, so I'm going to try this plan. It's more of, this plan didn't work, so I'm going to stop, this type of thing. And I think that's one of the things that the military can help with, is like, hey, the mission's the mission. We have to get there almost no matter what happens. I think that mentality just trains and teaches somebody like ourselves that, okay, we actually can make it through a whole wide variety of different obstacles. And a lot of it is just on me to control my emotions, to be very meticulous with, how I take care of myself, my equipment, all of those things, type of thing. So anything else that you would say kind of on that for a non-military member?
Well, you know what? And wasn't it one of the coolest things when you see this young person, whether they just graduate high school or college, and you just see them come into their own on the trail? Like when you first met them, they're super unsure of themselves. They didn't really know if they had it. And they just discovered through it, like, oh, I do have this. And you by the time you're done, they're almost a completely different person. They've got confidence. They once they get that confidence, they know, okay, I can push my body, and it's just like how it was in selection, right? It's not the people you think it's going to be. There's plenty of military people, like you observed before, that dropped out of the trail, and there's plenty of civilians that you think, what's this nerd doing? And they crushed it by the end, just crushing miles, flying by everybody. So I thought that was a really cool thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things I'm very passionate about sharing this trail as a transitional tool for veterans, but I cannot, underestimate at all the power of a normal civilian, as we'll call it, stepping out on trail, because you're exposing yourself to something that, even though it is a different arena, you're going through a six month-ish obstacle that requires mind, body, and soul, which is very similar to selection courses in the military. And I think, to your point, finding a young individual, which we encountered, dozens of those, they're finding themselves on the trail the same way we did during basic training and selection and deployment. And of course, it's a different world, but it's the same process. And that's why it's so valuable for people in different phases of life that are either looking to elevate themselves or looking to answer, internal questions about themselves. Think about the young men that join the military. A lot of it, especially the younger you are, you're joining to answer questions about yourself, right? Which is a really cool thing. And the trail can do something like that. And guess what? You don't even have to go to war at the end of it. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah.
So let's talk about kind of on the trail. Let's talk about some of the challenges you encountered and, challenges, obstacles. How'd you navigate them?
Well, I think the biggest obstacle for our year, everybody that thru hiked in, was it 2021? The rain. On my 5 months, I think I went back through, we had about 67 days of rain, and 26 of those were in July. So Vermont, which is already nicknamed Vermud, we walked through Vermont and New Hampshire with 26 days of rain almost continuously. And I think that was a pretty big low point for most people that were on that part of the trail at that time. I remember even when it wasn't raining, the humidity was just so high that your clothes couldn't dry out. They were starting to rot somewhat. People getting trench foot. We had like 4 tropical storms go over the Appalachians right in a row, and a hurricane as well, I think.
Yeah.
And that's the easiest time to get down on yourself, right? You're cold, you're wet, there's no hope of drying out. That, I think for most people, that was probably the low point. I think a lot of people dropped off the trail around that time.
Yeah, I think it was that month of July we had, if I remember correctly, at the very beginning of that tropical storm was a massive heat wave. And on the tail end of it was a massive heat wave. And I think a lot of it was because of the storms and the hurricanes that were starting to happen. But I mean, I think when I was in Connecticut, leading up to kind of the Vermont area or whatever, I think we hit days where it was 107 degrees. And then a big thing that a big issue we were dealing with in that area was there was a massive infestation of gypsy moths that were not just falling all over you all the time and you're just like covered in their guts and everything because you're smushing them, but they actually had eaten all the foliage out of the trees. And so, they call the Appalachian Trail the green tunnel. I'm a very fair-skinned individual, and I was like, man, how much sunscreen am I gonna have to wear all the time? Yeah. But on the trail, I was actually like almost never. But you hit that section, and it didn't matter if you were in an open field or in the woods. The sun exposure was identical because the trees had close to nothing, and so massive heat spikes. And then we dealt with that, as you said, 20 plus days of consecutive rain, which I know for me, like at some point, I just started to enjoy it because I was disgusted. You know what I mean? And it just became a game of like, I'm just going to see how wet I can be today. And guess what? You're as wet as you can be by like the first 20 minutes you're outside of your tent. Yeah. And you're packing, a soggy sponge called your tent back into your bag, and you're trying to find an opportunity to wring it out at some point during the day. And yeah, I mean, that's really where that like endurance and fortitude piece comes in. And unfortunately, I'm sure for both of us, that's where we really saw kind of the hiking bubble that we were in dissipated itself. I was in a consistent group, in and out of 30 or 40 people where we're all hiking about the same, speed at that time. And I think by the end of that wave, there was half a dozen left that I knew that had either not had to, that dropped off completely or skipped massive sections to get past that stuff. Or just had to, take a 2 or 3 week break and then we're that much farther behind type of situation. Okay, so kind of talking about, that specific obstacle of the weather. So let's talk about kind of the physical and mental demands. And I want to kind of reference something that we had talked about a couple of days ago when we were doing a kind of a pre-show call. It's kind of like the relational, I call that on the mental side, some of the relational stresses that happen. But let's talk about like physical injuries and then mental obstacles to overcome. So what were they? How'd you navigate them? What'd you learn from them?
So I think this happened a couple times with the heat waves. My first day I broke 30 miles was in New Jersey. It was right after Henri came through. So we had massive flooding and then an immediate heat wave after. So between Connecticut, where we had the heat dome, and New Jersey, when I had the second heat wave, um, just dealing with not having heat stroke, like severe heat stroke, because there was about 3 inches of standing water that I was just walking through. And then it was over 100 degrees out. So you just have this muggy, just miserable, hot experience. And I have already had a heat stroke in the Army. So it's a big balance between how to push through it without shutting your kidneys down and heat catting on the trail by yourself. It's really important, and you got to listen to your body. And I think especially for veterans, it's really easy to just ignore it. And you don't have that option on the trail because there's nobody necessarily there to catch you and be like, hey, this dude's passed out on the side of the trail. As far as musculoskeletal, man, I know you had problems too, but after the trail, I couldn't walk up or down stairs for at least a month without using a handrail. Like I was 90. My knees were pretty beat up by the end. I think between that and foot care, you get pretty obsessive about foot care. Like I had in my hip pouch toenail clippers, because I remember the first time I was like, yeah, my toenail's a little bit off. It's not a big deal. Well, after 20 miles of your toenail being off, now your toe's bleeding, and you've got a pretty rough next couple of days. So it's just listening to your body a lot. And then obviously nutrition, you're eating all this food that doesn't go bad and has almost no micronutrients, and you definitely feel it by the end of the trail.
Yeah, I think the kind of degradation of the body is there. It's unavoidable. You know what I mean? With it, when it comes to the fueling and stuff like that, you are kind of limited into especially when you're trying to do the mileage that we did.
Yeah.
You honestly don't have time to eat half the time. So you're eating stuff that you can eat while you're walking. Cause when we linked up eventually, that's really when my mileage spiked. So thank you / I'll fight you for that. But we were hiking 11 to 14 hours a day regularly, sometimes more, occasionally less. But with that, a lot of our consumption of food happened while we were moving or while I was laying down in my tent at night, just shoveling potatoes and stuffing into my body, trying to get warm because it's 9 p.m. We just rolled into camp and the temperature is dropping dramatically. You know what I mean? So let's talk about kind of the mental side. When we had talked earlier, we had talked about relationships, and we kind of actually came to a really cool parallel conclusion about like the military and the relationship issues that happen with that. So talk me through, what did you learn from the body side? So recap that real quick, going forward, what'd you learn about taking care of your body? And then let's jump into the kind of the mental aspect of it.
So I think this is the first time, as far as calories go, where there's a couple other times in my life where I can remember as soon as I was done eating, being immediately hungry. And I'd say at the end of Virginia on her flip-flop, so probably almost 2/3 of the way through, that's when my calorie consumption really spiked, and it kind of snuck up on me. And I started the trail with some cushioning, right? So I was like, it's whatever, I need to lose the fat anyways. And then you run out of fat, and it's like, wow, my body is like, all I thought about all day was food, and it gets a lot harder to stay warm. And so, that was the big takeaway. It was like, okay, I need to just not let my body get to this point. And how to eat 4,000 calories in a day, and because it is a chore, dude. Eating 4,000 calories when you're walking, it's a big task. As far as the relationships go, I would say the trail was the first major adventure where I was away from home and had a serious relationship. And so making the time to maintain those relationships on trail, obviously I want to still have a girlfriend by the end of the trail. So you better make time. It's not going to happen naturally. And it's the same thing, in the military, right? It's so easy to get caught up in the day to day because it's so intense. that it's not going to happen naturally. And you have to make a conscious effort, oh, we're at a high point, guys. We got cell phone signal. Let me call my girlfriend and talk to her for a little bit. I'll meet you guys in camp, and it's the same thing with the military, right? It's so easy to just kind of try to wait for it to naturally happen, and then it just doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things we had talked about the other day was, the divorce rate in the special operations community, but I'll reference Ranger Regiment specifically, is in the high 90%. So that is staggering. And, it was always complexing to me of why that happened. I had a relationship interest when I joined the military, and I ended it because it was new to an extent. And I honestly just didn't know what was coming around the corner for me. And I knew I needed to be extremely focused. And I think that's one of the massive tragedies that happens to service members is they put the mission first, their family second, and themselves last. And the problem is the mission is just going to stay first. And the family and you are not going to be dealt with basically until you get out. I know from my own personal experience, and I'm sure you can share on some of this as well. When I got out of the military, the assumption that you're just going to be able to fall back into how life was is completely wrong, because you've changed dramatically. The people in your life have changed dramatically. And if you have not put in the footwork to upkeep that relationship, it's almost like you both don't even know each other anymore. And that's with your family, that's with relationships. And I think that's why you see such an estrangement, which happened to me also personally, where people come back, they fought to get back to their family, and they come back and then they end up leaving them almost immediately, because it's just not what they remembered. And that goes both ways. You come back expecting a certain support system, and it might not be there, and that's no fault of really anyone's. And then on the other side, your family and friends, you left as a certain version, and if you do not upkeep that communication, they will not be able to organically watch you change. And then you're going to come back as a foreign individual, and it's going to be really hard to reconnect with those people, because it's like foreign ground type of thing,
Absolutely.
So I think the advice that I would give, to specifically the active duty military members, or even guys that are getting ready to transition, is, I know you're preoccupied. I know this is an overwhelming career path that you're in, but your family is probably why you joined in the first place, your family and friends. And you will lose the thing that you're trying to serve the most by serving the greater good. You can do both. It just takes priorities, task management, communication, and that stuff that you learn how to do for the mission. And you forget that you're actually really learning how to do those skills for life. And it makes you a great leader, a great communicator, all of these things. But if you don't put in the work to actively start that process in your personal life while you're still in, you're kicking the can down the road. And it is a process. And so when you get out, if you have not proactively started that, you're looking at potentially a couple years of additional work that you need to do, which is where we see a lot of the discouragement that comes into veterans, because they feel very lost. They left a community at home to go join a new community, and then they leave that community to come back to the other one, not realizing that they have to put in the same work to rebuild that community, potentially add and subtract from what it is. And that's just a hard process. That's one of when we think about the sacrifice that comes with military service, that's probably one of the ones that gets under thought about or looked over, is the personal, relational sacrifice that ends up happening as a byproduct of busyness and lack of communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard, I mean, especially on the trail, there's some times where it's just this is not a great place to stop. It's getting dark. We don't know. And it's just you know what? We'll figure it out. I got a headlamp, I've got to make time.
Yeah.
And it looks absurd to other hikers, right? Because they're fully immersed and they see this little huddle of dudes with girlfriends on the high point trying to get signal, but
that's
lives.
And that's a huge thing, right? I mean, we had people that could not separate themselves from their families or relationships because they were fearful of stuff, and they just were needed to be tied in. That's not what we're talking about necessarily. What we're talking about is you are so comfortable doing things on your own that you'll forget to re-involve the people that are very important to you, which kind of leads us into our next talking point, which is kind of the connection, support, and community piece. So what was kind of the surprising community and connection that you found along the trail, and what did that look like?
I don't think it was as much of a surprising new discovery as more of a reminder, bringing us back to, oh, we knew this. As far as, even though in our daily lives, there's so much difference and there's so many people trying to tell us that we're not alike and can't get along. Once you have that shared adversity and you talk about not the daily just small talk, but big topics, how really similar a lot of us are and how many great people there are, of all kinds of different backgrounds. And the trail is an awesome way of doing that because you just find driven people of all different backgrounds, and so you get to meet all kinds of cool people from different places you've never been. And you get a pretty close relationship with them because you guys are all relying on each other, whether it's conscious or unconscious, right? You snap your ankle and you've got to crawl back to the road. It'd be really nice if somebody stopped to help you,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
definitely builds that bond.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things of, to your point, we just live in a time and space in society now where divisiveness is part of daily culture, apparently. And we very much are choosing sides, choosing teams, fighting this, fighting that. I think a lot of that just comes from lack of purpose and too much excess stimulus. On the trail, similar to when you're in the military, life gets compressed to the essentials: food, shelter, water, survival, in a sense. That's why in the military, you have people from such a wide variety of backgrounds, ethnicities, all this type of stuff, and they just meld together because of the mission. The Appalachian Trail and any other long through hiker, endurance athlete style event is going to produce the same product, where you might have different political opinions, you might have different religious opinions, irrelevant, because what you're going to do is gather together over where's the next water point, where are we sleeping tonight, who's injured, how can I help you, what do I need for help, and that's not just through hikers, that's also the through hiking community that surrounds it, which I think is one of the main reasons I want to push specifically military veterans towards the Appalachian Trail opposed to the other major hikes in the U.S. is the excessive social community that supports it. So one of the cool things about, the 14 states that you walk through on the Appalachian Trail is a lot of it is very rural, backcountry, mountain towns, small communities, salt of the earth people that are very excited to see the challenge that you're doing. They're inspired by it and they want to help. And so the amount of, free rides of hitchhikes and stuff that people offered, letting you stay at their house, people buying you meals, people helping out with a whole variety of logistics was very eye-opening to me. Especially coming out of the military, I was very much dealing with that void of community because I lost my team. I came back to find my team that I had prior. It wasn't there. Some of that was my own fault. Some of that was just, again, what we talked about, lack of communication. People grow in different directions. And when you don't communicate about it, you feel like you're foreign to each other again. And so, I personally stepped out on the trail with a huge void in my life for community and purpose, and was very much happily surprised at how much the trail provided community from some of the weirdest opportunities I could have ever imagined, and support from people. And obviously that was happening from home as well, but it was very important. I stepped out on the trail with probably the mindset of being like, I'm going to go disappear into the woods and be by myself and be angry for the next 4 to 6 months. And in reality, what ended up happening was one of the happier times of my life. Definitely not without challenge and personal growth that needed to happen to make that achievable. But I was very happily surprised that I was unable to keep secluding myself, which is something that veterans will do. It's something that people that just, got laid off from a job or retiring or just got out of a relationship and they're in that transitional space, they'll get lost in that and they'll want to seclude themselves consciously or subconsciously, and that trail will not allow you to do that, which was extremely powerful for me.
Yeah, I think it's a common trap, especially special operations, right? For us speaking to Rangers, where it's this idea of I can only rely on Rangers. And it's like, okay, well, how many Rangers do you know in your daily life when you get out? You don't. You've got your buddies that you stay tight with and communicate with, but you got to learn how to rely on other people. And it doesn't mean everybody's reliable, right? But there's plenty of reliable people that have the resilience that you need in those scenarios and in everyday life,
Absolutely. So let's kind of talk about, we're working our way kind of chronologically through the trail. So let's talk about what were some of the unexpected, like post trail lessons that you've learned that have enhanced you as an individual. Because now here we are 2 years post when I even met you, right? We're actually over 2 years past that at this point. So what were some of those unexpected lessons, not just from the trail, but the ones that you learned afterwards in hindsight or in reflection?
Man. So I think the biggest noticeable one, right, when we got back is your bullshit meter is way lower, right? It's when your day-to-day life, you get just, it builds up slowly, right? And so you just kind of roll with it. Well, when you step out and then you step back into that life, it just kind of smacks you in the face because you haven't been dealing with it for 5, 6 months. So you are so much more sensitive to, wait, what is going on here? Why are we doing this? And I think that that's, well, I mean, there's consequences to that, right? But I think there's a lot of merit to that just because it's so easy to be trapped in a situation that's not beneficial, and you just go with it because that's what you're used to. Try and think looking back.
I think that's one of the, as a kind of a parallel, very similar to like deployment. I think one of the reasons guys actively want to go back, it's not just the combat operation piece. I think part of it is the life gets, again, compressed down to such a simple version that it's easier to feel purpose. It's easier to feel community. It's easier to let the BS, roll off of your shoulder. I think when we get back into the complexity of the current day that we live in 2024, where you have social media blasting you work in a corporation that is of 20,000 people and you feel like you're a number, you lose sight of that tight-knit community that you were accustomed to where you're, gathering around a, fire pit at the end of an operation to discuss things, build that bond, whatever. That people get so engrossed with their own lives, in the military. It's like you do your job and then what do you have to do after? Just hang out with the guys. In the normal life, you'll go to your job, you'll get out, you're going to be on social media, you're going to be on, whatever it may be, and you're going to actually be further away from people than you ever could imagine, even though they're right in front of you on a screen. There's that like personal disconnect. And I think it just makes people feel small and unvaluable to the world because they're not playing a significant piece of anything. And so I think some of these like transitional spaces and challenges like the Appalachian Trail, and there's 1,000 other opportunities it can provide. It reminds you who you are, where you rank in the world. It gives you opportunities. I know for me, after getting out of the military, my brother had passed away from cancer 2 months after I got out. That spiraled me into a state of like, I have no control over my life. I can't help the people I love, which is stuff I was dealing with, post-deployment in the military as well. And then stepping out on the Appalachian Trail, I was afforded the opportunity to help other people that were injured, help other people get to their end state. And it reminded me of like, I do have purpose. I do have a place in this world. I'm still valuable. And that was extremely, important to me. And it's been something that I've been working on years and years afterwards, right? I was learning that on the trail in the moment, but it really hasn't set in until we have conversations like this. And I look back at how much my own opinions have changed, how much my anger has turned into, let me share this, my experience, so that other people don't get lost in that wilderness of fear, resentment, insecurity, doubt, all the things that will plague not just military veterans, but anyone that is in life that is dealing with something, right? Anything else kind of from like that reflection or things that have kind of changed you post trail or post any other major experience? The military is an easy one to go down the rabbit hole on.
Yeah, I think, well, one for me at least, so it brought it up with the trail names, which I know you talked about on previous episodes. But somebody who I was hiking with, a group of long trail guys, because there's a little bit of an overlap in Vermont between the long trail and the Appalachian Trail. We got to know each other, and he just kind of observed, like, you're kind of a Renaissance guy, and I was like, okay. So first, they were like, Renaissance man. They're like, no, we're going to call you Renaissance. And what that kind of reminded me is it's so easy to get trapped in this belief that you're just this one-dimensional caricature. And even if you're the most boring person ever, right? There's more to you than just one dimension. And it doesn't have to be just the military, right? I mean, the military is one that people tend to cling to, but any major transition, it could be layoff, it could be I'm, not in college anymore. There's so much more to you than just one aspect that any transition, it's pretty important to remember, hey, there's more to me. And I think on the trail, that was something that was really helpful where people kind of like observed all these different things about me that I wasn't consciously thinking about. And it's like, oh yeah, there is more to me than just that, and it's such a big trap that, we fall into when we get out of the military is that was so tied in with your identity and now it's not there anymore. So it's like, what am I? So, well, you're you, dude. There's all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually kind of starts to answer the next question, which was going to be, what advice from your own experience would you give others that are facing a transitional space, whatever that may be? Again, insert exiting the military, exiting college, death of a family member, end of a relationship, end of a career, whatever it may be. So just to summarize that again, what is that singular piece of advice or overarching piece of advice that you'd give somebody entering into the transition, from your own mistakes and accomplishments?
I'd say so. Transitions inherently aren't necessarily positive or negative, right? The death of a family member, that's pretty negative, but that's one type of transition, and it's just give yourself to the transition, right? You can't cling on to what can't happen anymore, right? That's gone. That's why we're in this transition now. So you just have to give yourself over to the situation you're in. And remember, there's more to you than just one aspect of your personality or one aspect of your life.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's probably one of the biggest things I've struggled with is I'm a very passionate person and I like to call myself an all or nothing. The problem with that is transition, this term we keep using, will happen dozens and dozens of times throughout your life, especially in the adult field of it. And so if you stake your whole identity on the career path that you're in and you get laid off, what's left?
Yeah.
If you stake all of your identity in a singular relationship, not that, marriage and stuff like that shouldn't be a priority, but you are still an individual within that relationship, and so to your point, having yourself, your soul, that is who you're made up of, and it is a kind of like a grouping of all the experience you've had, not a singular piece that defines you, and that's the military, that's the fatal flaw that guys have and why when guys get out, there's such a high veteran suicide rate and problems with transition, substance abuse, depression, all this stuff is because guys are getting out. They staked their entire identity and life on, I am a U.S. Army Ranger. And when you hang that floppy hat up, you're like, what is left of me? Well, you are actually the best version of yourself you've ever been. And you're about to take all the experiences that helped you become a special operations soldier, plus the experiences that you learned as a special operations soldier. And all it's done is prime you for the next experience of life. And so you are a ranger, you're a gunsmith, you're a mechanical engineer, you're a husband, you're a son, you're a friend, you're a accomplished thru hiker, an accomplished peak bagger, a business entrepreneur. You are made up of so much more that when one of those times, when the clock ends and it says, okay, this phase of life is transitioning into the next, you're more comfortable and fluid to adapt to the natural course of life, right?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So to kind of wrap some of this stuff up, storytelling and connection, why did you decide to come on this platform and share this personal story? What are you hoping to share to the wide variety of listener that could be on this?
I think the first thing, right, is you're not alone, right? We tend to really try to cling to that quiet professional for the most part. And the consequence to that is because everybody's just trying to stay quiet and they kind of shy away from public facing, it tricks you into thinking that you're the only one having those problems. And so I know a lot of my self-growth was through just being exposed to other people, that I looked up to openly talking about these problems, right? And then in obviously at the time, this is so short-sighted, but you're like, oh, well, if he has these problems, then obviously it's okay for me to have these problems. It's like everybody has those problems.
Mm-hmm.
But you just don't want to admit it because you have this ideal, that you have to maintain this facade, and that's just not necessary. And if I can help break that by somebody listening in, then I think that's worth it.
And that's huge. The reason I bring that up specifically is that's a huge thing you helped me with. One of my final questions I have here for you, is where does your personal philosophy come from? And the reason I ask that is, on the Appalachian Trail, I would say, it took me also just under 5 months. The first, call it 50% was me learning to start to let go of my own ego, my own inability to communicate, my own, anger, distrust of people, all these things. And so right around that 50% marker is when I started to open up. And there was a couple really cool trail relationships that I had with, couples and individuals prior to meeting you, where I started to voice some of these things and use it as a sounding board, and was getting a really cool, feedback and wide variety of advice, and understanding. It's therapy on a level you can't understand, because you're out there in deep thought, physically exhausting yourself, opening the floodgates of like your true emotional state. And then you have somebody else that you've been bonded to very closely through the obstacle, and you're able to discuss it with them either while you're hiking, at a lunch break, at dinner, at camp, whatever it may be. That to say, when me and you first met and then started hiking together, I think we spent, just under a month hiking together, which makes you the longest hiking partner that I had. I became comfortable based on the way that I saw you perceiving the world, and the way that you gave yourself advice, and the way that you talked about, subjects. You were a deep thinker. You're a historian, obviously. You're a very heavy reader, I can tell. But you gave me really sound advice, because not only did you give me advice from your own personal experience, because you were ahead of the game. You had transitioned out several years prior to me. You had dealt with some of the relational stuff. And so you were giving me advice on that. But you're also able to give me advice from a super deep pool of history that you've learned from. So tell me, and everyone else here, where does some of that deep philosophy come from that makes you such an asset to someone like myself that is very exclusive of who I take advice from?
Oh, man, where to start? Well, I think just as a personality, I'm the type of person that I hate making the same mistake twice. And so there are certain points in life where things just went bad, right? Things just happen, and you just sit down afterwards and you're like, okay, that was horrible. How did that happen? And how do I not have that happen again? Right? And that happens several times in your life where you just got to sit back and reflect. And I think, between those moments, and especially when you get out of the military and have all these thoughts, and a lot of time to yourself for the first time, I just wanted answers, and I figure, there's a lot of people who have thought about this a lot harder and are a lot more intelligent than I am, so let's start with where people have left off first, before I start trying to come up with my own answers. And so that just kind of led me down this rabbit hole, especially in college, where I would read, okay, well, let's read Eastern philosophy today, or, let's read some random epic from Mesopotamia that I've never read before. Because even if it's a religious context or not a religious context, right? I mean, thinking about how to make yourself better is kind of universal, and even if I don't fully adhere to whatever religious principles I'm reading at that time, right? You got to be able to boil it down and see, the parts that are useful, because there is everywhere, and I think between that and understanding that things that are important very rarely have a very simple answer, it kind of taught me to slow down and really think about it. I feel like if any major important question like that, if you can answer it in a sentence, you're probably wrong,
Mm.
And so once I changed to that thought process of, I want to hopefully understand all aspects and probably understand that really it's a nuanced thing. It's not a black and white, answer. I think that really helped my growth and really start searching everywhere I could,
Yeah, I kind of like the saying, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's something along the lines of like, if you don't learn from history, you're destined to repeat it, right? And I think that's one of the cool things you're saying is, regardless of the origin of the text, it's there for a reason. I would say that a lot of life problems have been the same since the origin of time. And so you've had people for thousands of years contemplating and trying to come up with solutions for the exact same thing that we're in today. It doesn't matter if we have technologies and all these things that have advanced, like the fundamentals of human beings are still the same. People still have depression, they still have anxiety, they still have doubt. Like those have not changed over time. They can get inflamed, I think, in a time that we live in now, and they're more prominent, and people have put them under a magnifying glass. It doesn't mean that they're any different or any more than what they were 1,000 years ago. So, utilizing history as a listen, I can sit here and ruminate on this for the rest of my life, or I can listen to the other thousands of people that have and try to learn from them as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. All right, man. Well, we're coming kind of to the conclusion here. So I want to end things on just giving you the opportunity to explain a little bit more in detail, kind of what the future plans are for you yourself, any personal challenges that you're looking for. And then also, talk about Spirit of Kalash and what does 2024 bring for that organization. And then kind of drop all of your guys' social media and stuff, which I'll link in here as well.
Okay. Yeah. So, man, well, Spirit of Kalash, we've got a pretty good team right now. We've got some guys that they're really putting their heart into it, and it's really starting to show. We're looking at expanding our classes for this year, both on the education side as far as firearms maintenance and knowledge, and also on range manipulations, manual of arms, and actual usage of the AK. So it's really cool vehicle that we've been given to be able to teach and give good information. And then on the shop side, really coming along. Now we have our FFL set up in Pennsylvania. So we're taking in work, and that's pretty exciting, especially with the SOT. I think we're going to be able to do a lot of cool work. Hopefully as time goes on, obviously we're always trying to buy more equipment, and that will kind of expand what we're able to make and the type of jobs that we're able to do and provide for people. Hopefully by the end of 2024, we can actually go out and teach classes in other places. That's kind of my internal goal for us, is to leave our Pennsylvania footprint, go out to other parts of the country and teach. As far as for personal hiking, I'm somewhere, I forgot to check, I'm somewhere in the 70s for the Northeast 111, which is the high peaks for the Northeast. I really like to knock out the rest of the New Hampshire portion. I've got 25 mountains down, and there's 48, so I have 23 to go. I'd love to be able to just finish that off just for something for the year. Long term, I'd love to finish the Triple Crown and pursue further with mountaineering, but that takes time, as you know.
Absolutely. That's awesome. So just real quick on Spirit of Kalash. So as you guys stand right now, as a consumer, what products are currently available?
So right now, we do repair services for AKs. We can do other things too. It's less frequent just because there's less of them going around, but we can do FALs, ARs, pistols, whatever. We do parts kit builds, which is basically, for those who don't know, obviously in the US, once something is a machine gun, it can't not be a machine gun. And so AKs, for the most part, are machine guns. So what happens is when these other countries get rid of their guns, they will do what's called demilling for export, and they'll chop them up. So what a parts kit is most of the usable pieces, but the firearm is no longer a firearm because usually it's been torch cut, and you're never putting that thing back together as it is. So what we do is we take the correct amount of U.S. civilian legal components and rebuild the rifle into something that is civilian legal. So that's the parts kits builds are something that we offer. Right now, we're going to launch our first AK familiarization class, which is for people that are either new to AKs or want to get started into it or just bought one. And we can give you all the baseline information, so you can make better decisions with parts and what to buy and how to use it. And then we have our build classes. So our build class is where you get to rent out the shop for 2 days, and we sit down with you and we actually go through the whole process of building an AK from parts. And by the end of the class, you've got a completed AK that obviously we send it back to your FFL, but it's yours to keep. You just bring in your parts and we knock it out.
Okay, that's exciting, man. That sounds really cool, actually. I'm excited to come out and do that myself. So I know you guys are kind of still similar to myself in the process of building out the website and all that type of stuff. So let's just start with what is currently available, whether that's Instagram, Facebook, etc. So drop those handles and I'll also link them in here as well.
Okay, so my personal gunsmithing page is Eric the Smith with very specific underscores. I kind of shadow banned right now because of the gun content. Spirit of Kalash, you can either look up Spirit of Kalash, or our current handle is FJ60Joe. One of the consequences of being a smaller gun page is you can get shut down pretty easily. So we kind of unfortunately have had to bounce through. But those are our two main ones. If you want to reach out for quotes on gunsmithing work or kit builds, you can reach out at eric@grukamanufacturing.com. And I can usually answer within about a day, and we can get you started on, what you want. If you're not sure what you want, but you want a place to look, we can set you up with, a pretty good starting point of, hey, this is what a lot of people do, depending on what you're doing. This is the route you may want to take. If you want to take it, we can step you through the whole process down to, getting you built up and getting your new rifle.
That's awesome, man. All right. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of this. So personally, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate your friendship, all the advice you give me over the years. Definitely, consumer of your product as well. So I'm here to support your guys' business ventures. Any other closing comments that you'd like to have?
No, man, thanks for having me. Like I said, dude, I remember us talking about this on the trail, and you're like, I think I want to do a podcast. And it's like, if you do a podcast, man, I'll be on it. So It's cool to finally do it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you, brother. So we'll have all those handles in there, guys. Go check out Spirit of Kalash and check out Eric's gunsmithing page. Obviously, that's kind of a unique niche that they're offering right now. So take advantage of that while it's here and available. So, Eric, I appreciate you guys, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.
Sounds good, man.